guys, Grimish here from Abandoned Apart Alliance. Today we're going to talk about ship basics, so the basic information that a new player should know about ships in EVE that applies to pretty much every ship in the game. First things first, when you're in your hangar, I'm in Amarr right now. This ship is an Astero, which is a frigate. When you're in a hangar and you want to access the fitting menu, it's this little ship fitting button. The icon, if you're really brand new, is a stylized rifter inside of a little fitting ring. So we'll go ahead and click that, and that brings up your fitting screen. And I'll just do a very quick rundown of all the parts of the screen and then go through each part, and then hopefully wrap everything up. So starting with the big ring, in the middle you'll see your ship, and then around the ring you'll see the 4 different slot types in the game. You have your high slots, which are generally weapons and utility items. You'll have your mid slots, which are generally propulsion, electronic warfare, tackle, and shield items with some utility items. You have low slots, which generally tend to be damage controls, armor, and weapon upgrades or modules, and possibly navigational upgrades that are not propulsion modules, like an afterburner or a micro warp drive. Those go in the mid slots. And then over on the kind of 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock area, you have your rigs, which are permanent modules that get equipped to your ship that cannot be unfit, unlike other modules. So these guys are permanent. The only way to get rid of them is to destroy them. Every other module type you can equip and unequip as you want. And as you go around the ring, you see these little icons. They give you a couple options. If a module doesn't have any sort of ammunition, you get unfit, which will send it to your inventory if I click it. Let's go put that guy back on. You have info, which after a decent load time will pull up the information tab for the module that gives you very detailed information about everything that the module affects. And then you have put offline, which simply puts the module in an offline status so it doesn't use any power grid or CPU. And you can undock with items in an offline status, but you can't use them in space unless they're online. If you're in space and you want to put something offline online, I believe you have to have 95% capacitor, which may be tough. Not to say there are not places where you can refit in space, but plan accordingly. So that is the very, and if a module has ammunition, like this sensor booster can fit scripts, there's this extra set of options that is for the actual charge or item you have equipped into the module. And you can also remove the charge. So that's the fitting ring. If you really want, you can spin your ship around with a little background. Next, let's kind of talk about the slots a little bit more in detail. High slots generally consist of weapons, which are either turrets or missile launchers. This ship can fit 2 turrets, so under the turret icon, or the turret hardpoint icon, you'll see 2 little pips. These are empty right now. This means that this ship can equip up to 2 turrets. I don't have any turrets equipped. I have a cloak and a probe launcher equipped because this is one of my scouting ships. But if either of these were turrets, they would fill the pips up until it was full. You can have more high slots than actual hard points for turrets or missile launchers. The missile launcher pips show up over underneath the missile launcher hard point. Oftentimes then people refer to those extra high slots beyond what your turret capacity is as your utility slots, where you can fit various things. Like you could fit energy neutralizers or energy vampires in there. You can fit drone damage and control upgrades in there, depending. Various utility items that improve your ship. In your mid slots, as I said, generally you will find a propulsion module. I have a micro warp drive equipped. You could also have an afterburner, or you could have a jump drive. Afterburners are somewhat fast, micro warp drives are very fast, and micro jump drives have a delay but jump you a exceedingly long distance while you're out in space. Then you can also have shield modules in the mid slots, either shield extenders, shield resistance, shield boosters. There's a whole bunch of modules that can fit in here under shields. Mid slots are generally, a ship with a lot of mid slots is considered often to have a shield tank. We can talk about that in another video more in depth. You can also have E-War. I happen to have a warp scrambler, or 2 warp scramblers fit to this ship. You could also have sensor disruptors, utility items like tracking enhancers. I have a sensor booster. A lot of utility stuff can fit in the mids, and some weapon upgrades can fit in the mid slots. In the low slots, especially for newer players, you'll almost always see a damage control. Damage control improves your defenses all around, and I'll come back to this. You can also have armor modules. This happens to improve my armor resistances. Drone upgrades often fit in the lows. Since this ship uses drones, it has a drone damage amplifier. And I also have a hull or propulsion modifier in here, module in here. This makes my ship more agile, so I actually have covered the bases pretty well on the low slots on this ship. Also worth noting, in the slots, for your high, mid, and low slots, you will see a maximum of 8 of each for any given ship. 8 is the hard limit right now for number of modules per slot type. You won't see too many ships that have an 8-8-8 layout, but the layout we'll touch base on at the end of this video. And then finally you have your rig slots. Every ship either has, I believe, 2 or 3 rig slots. I think some ships have, I think freighters do not have any rig slots, but most ships have either 2 or 3 rig slots that you can fit rigs in. Moving out from the ring, we have your CPU and power grid kind of numerical counters, and then right here, these 2 hatch-marked quadrants of the circle. This one is measuring your CPU, and this one is your power grid, showing you in a relative sense from 0 to maximum how much of each you're using up. And then you have the same thing over here for rig calibration. All of these stats, calibration, CPU, and power grid, are literally just hard limits for what you can fit on a ship, and are used primarily to kind of balance the game and make you make choices, so that if you want to have a whole bunch of super high powered weapons, you're probably going to have to sacrifice to fit those, or if you want a really strong tank, you're going to have to make choices about how many items and which items or modules you're going to fit. So these are just constraints that limit what you can actually fit to your ship. So now let's move to the right side of the fitting window. At the very top you have the name of your ship. You can change this. Just, well, I'm not doing it very well right now, but you can change, oh, I'm sorry. You can click on your ship and hit change name, and it'll let you change the name that appears for your ship. And then you can have fun naming your ships. Below that, you have capacitor. This is the power that runs your ship. I like to think of it as the nuclear plant in the middle that makes everything hum along, and your capacitor is constantly regenerating at a set rate based on your modules and your ship stats. And this ship is currently operating cap stable, which means I can turn everything that's fit on and run it indefinitely. I'm cap stable at a capacitor rate of 18%. So that means if I take this ship out and just fly it in space with everything burning, it'll stabilize at 18% here. You don't have to have a cap stable ship, especially PvP fits are often not cap stable. PvE fits tend to be a bit more cap stable because of the demands of missions and not fighting other wily pilots. But there are ways to impact this with various modules, either capacitor regeneration modules, capacitor booster modules. There's a lot of ways to impact this. The key thing is to note that if you get to 0, everything shuts down. Anything that requires power to run, anything that requires capacitor to run, will shut down if you get to 0 and will not reactivate. And then the final note about capacitor is it has a sweet spot at about 33% capacitor, which is actually the point at which it regenerates fastest. It's not a linear regeneration rate from 0 to 100. It slows down below 33% and slows down above 33%. So that can be useful to know when you're doing fitting shenanigans with your ship. Next up is offense. Don't have too much to say about offense, except this just tells you how much damage your various weapon systems do. You've got DPS from your turrets, damage per second, drone damage, and missile damage. Now let's look at defenses. Right across the top here, this number right here is your effective hit points. This is kind of a summation of everything below and gives you a rough idea of how much damage your ship can take from initiating combat to blowing up. Now if we go down, you'll see there's columns and rows. In the columns we have active defenses, which I'll come back to. It'll show you the various ways you can repair or restore your hit points. Oops. You have 3 layers of defense. You have shield, armor, and structure, or often people say hull. Shield recharges over time and works very similar to your capacitor. It has a peak recharge rate at 33%, but it has a set time to go from 0 to 100. Armor and structure do not regenerate on their own. You need a module of some sort to repair them. Shields also have repair modules. They're called shield boosters. There's also shield regenerators, but we'll leave that for another video. And then here you can see you can toggle if you have a shield booster, a hull repairer, or an armor repairer. You can toggle to see what your rate would be, but since I don't have any of these fit, my passive shield recharge rate, 3 hit points a second, this ship's going to really last. But you can see all the different ways your ship can run, and we'll talk about that more in another video. And then finally we have the resistance columns. There's 4 types of damage in EVE. These are the 4 types. EM, thermal, kinetic, and explosive. And each layer of armor has its own resistance profile. Essentially what this does is if you get shot and the bullet hits your shields, because it hits shields first, then armor, and then structure. If it hits armor or shield first, it mitigates this percentage of damage, or it removes that percentage of damage from your incoming damage. So if I shoot you for 100 explosive damage and it hits your shields, it only does 50. Same thing if I shoot you when you're in armor with that same 100 explosive damage, I will do 54 damage because this removes 46%. Before I mentioned the damage control, and if you can see this on your screen, take a look. It increases across the board shield damage resistance, armor damage resistance, and hull damage resistance. So this module is often a slam dunk when building a ship. Not always, but often. Especially as a new player, it's never a bad idea to fit your damage control. And there are a myriad number of modules in the game that can impact both your raw hit points in each of these, your resistances in each of these, and how you can restore these both on your ship and how you can remotely restore hit points to a friend's ship, or your friend can restore it to you. So defense is a whole episode all on its own. Moving on, we have targeting. The very first item is how far you can target. What is your maximum targeting range? This is especially important with drones and long-range weapons, because if you can't target it, you can't tell your weapons to shoot it, and you can't tell your drones to hit it. So this is how far you can reach out and touch someone. Then we have sensor strength. The exact name of your sensor strength will vary based on the race of your ship. There are 4 different types that match the 4 races. Essentially, the higher your sensor strength, the harder it is to be found by scan probes or jammed by E-War. Next we have signature radius, which is essentially how big you look to everybody else's weapons and targeting equipment and scanning equipment. Kind of opposed to that is scan resolution. The bigger or the higher your scan resolution, the faster you can lock onto targets, especially smaller targets. And then finally we have maximum locked targets, which is exactly what it sounds like, how many things in space you can target at once. This can be useful, especially if you're flying logistics, to have a very high locked target number. And also just helps, it's less micromanagement. Almost done, let's go to navigation. Navigation shows how fast you go. This is showing my speed kind of naked. If I go over here and mouse over my propulsion module, you'll see it shows that my max velocity without it is 424 meters a second, and with it it's 3,041 meters per second. But again, this is just how fast you go. Here we have mass. Mass is how fast you get up to speed and how fast you turn. So the higher your mass, the worse your performance, kind of like a car. Also, if you live in wormholes, mass can be very important on bigger ships as you start crossing wormholes, but that's a topic for another video. Inertia modifier, also often called agility by players, is how fast you accelerate and how fast you turn. The lower your inertia modifier, the faster you align. This is very important for ships that want to get around quickly and want to maybe avoid being locked by faster targets that can't lock as fast as you can warp away. And then we have ship warp speed, which is once you get into warp, what the maximum speed you can get to in warp is. Like a lot of things in EVE, this is not linear. When you start warp, you start accelerating until the midpoint of your warp and then decelerating to the end point of your warp. So if your warp is too short, you'll never hit your maximum speed. But having a high warp speed helps you get around fast. Generally speaking, larger ships have slower warp speeds. I believe interceptors are the fastest based warp speed in the game, and I think freighters are the slowest. Capital ships may be slower, but I've never tried to warp a capital ship. Finally, we have 2 little ancillary bits. We have the cargo hold, which is just how much fits in your cargo hold, and your drone bay. We'll talk about drones more later, but the short thing to say is that your drone bay holds drones that you can actually deploy in space. It's not necessarily how many drones you can fly at once. In anything that's not a carrier, carrier or supercarrier, you can only field a maximum of 5 drones, but you may be able to carry more or alternates. So worth knowing. So that is the ship fitting screen in a nutshell, as fast as I could go through it. Not as fast as I'd like, but you will learn to love this screen as you play EVE. Hope this has been educational. Let me know what you think in the comments, if there's anything we can do to improve this episode, or if there's any other topics you'd like me to do an episode about. Again, this is Grimish from the A Band Apart Alliance. Thank you very much.